In our couples devotional today, we are going to look at marriage tips from Jesus based on Matthew chapter 5, which is the Sermon on the Mount. And if you know anything about the Sermon on the Mount, this was Jesus's longest sermon that he gave. And not only was it the longest sermon, but it was also the most provocative things that he spoke of. He really kind of rocked the world of those that were listening. So let's look at the text and then see how it's going to apply to marriage today. So starting from Matthew chapter 5 and verse 21, you have heard that it is said, the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who's angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come and offer your gift. So we see this idea that Jesus is talking about murder and then he's talking about anger. And what we see, what his purpose was, is Jesus was going beyond the letter of the law to reveal a heart condition. We have to remember that a lot of the people in the audience that day, he's speaking mainly to his followers, to his disciples, but for a lot of people, they're thinking, well, I know the Old Testament law. I can follow that. And murder, oh man, everybody would give an outcry of that. Of course you wouldn't want to do that. But Jesus is going to something a little bit deeper than just the obvious of things we wouldn't want to do, like murder, to talk about anger. So the question you might be asking is, well, why make a connection between murder and anger? Well, Jesus wanted to shake things up. He was calling his followers to something more radical than just what the Old Testament law said. He wanted to expose the heart issue. Murder is horrible, obviously. Any of us would agree with that. But so are the results of what happens in the wake of our anger. And you see that in the text, don't murder, subject to judgment. He says that also anyone who is angry with his brother is subject to judgment. So what Jesus is talking about is saying, hey, guys, you might think that you have it all together. You might feel like you've got the letter of the law down and you know the Old Testament rules and you follow them line by line. But I want to talk to you about your heart and that anger. Even though anger certainly doesn't always lead to something as horrific as murder, but anger can have lasting damage in relationships, and that's what Jesus was going to. So here's how I want that to apply to marriage. I want you guys to evaluate if anger is a problem for you. And here's a couple questions to ask yourself. Do you harbor things in your heart against your spouse or another person for that matter? Are you treating them with contempt? Are you just in general pretty angry with your spouse? Are you short-fused? Are you irritated? Are you just always very quick to think the worst of their motivations? Are you really impatient with them? Are you going through the motions, even at church, knowing that you have unfinished business with your spouse? For a lot of us, we can go through life and we can pretend and put on our happy face and smile, but in our hearts, we know that there's some yucky stuff going on in there. And so here's the idea. If you evaluate that anger is something that has taken root in your heart, then deal with it before it leads you to sin. That's what Jesus is talking about here. He's not saying, listen, it's obvious for most of us that murder isn't something that any of us have any interest in doing. But anger is something that we all struggle with. And I challenge you to not even let anger be something that reigns in your heart. And what he says in verse 24 there is, go and be reconciled. So if you evaluate that anger is something that you're dealing with, especially in your marriage, deal with it. And here's how you can do that. Here's the questions that talk about it. Go over these, have a conversation with your spouse, and make a determination. Your marriage tip from Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount is, don't let anger be the condition of your heart.